Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weebunion, and in this one we start out in the Kursk region where the Russians have managed to capture this first patch southeast of Kalinov. The Russians have been fighting in a counter-offensive operation to regain control over the Kursk region, where the main fighting is happening on the western flank of the Ukrainian Kursk incursion. There's also been some developments in the southeastern flank, and recently the Russians have increased their efforts in the northern flank as well. There's been several developments this past few days of the month, which has allowed the Russians to advance in three separate parts of the northern flank, both in the northeastern parts where the Russians are attempting to advance along the railways to cut off the supply to the Ukrainian forces in the positions closest to the front line, and now with positional fighting here in the western part as well, it could be an attempt by the Russians to cut off the supplies of the Ukrainians and close in on them on both of the flanks. The fighting is taking place along the railways, where the Russians are looking to secure the railways, while at the same time hitting the Ukrainian positions within the settlements. Now we see that the Russians are also advancing on the forest areas near the open fields. We see that there are several settlements, but they are far from the Russian positions here near Kalinov. This is an attempt by the Russians to secure their northern flank as they continue operations towards Suchit. The Russians don't want to risk their forces getting hit in the rear with a pincer maneuver by the Ukrainians here northeast of their current offensive operations. Therefore, they are looking to secure the areas by capturing the forest areas and pushing the Ukrainians back on a wider front while they clear up the pocket here by Lyubimovka. Since I uploaded 2 updates yesterday, there's not a lot for this morning. However, we see several developments here in the Remevsky Ledge area. The Russians have advanced further in the southern flank of Solotaniva, and at the same time they've advanced further along the Levatne direction following the capture of the settlement. Starting out by Solotaniva, the Russians have managed to secure another forest line here to the west of the settlement. This secures the road going to and from Solotaniva from Donetsk, and this will allow better connection between the Russian forces here on the eastern flank of Velyka Novosilka, as the Russians will likely continue advancing along the river line and highway between Velyka Novosilka and Solotaniva. The majority of the Ukrainian fortified positions are in the northern bank of the river line. This means that the southern bank of the river line is largely just open fields. This makes for prime targets for the UAV operators as well as artillery of the Ukrainians in this section of the front line. Velyka Novosilka, although it is located on the low ground, any area really by river lines are located at the low ground because the rivers move through the low ground as water goes to the lowest point. Therefore, all of these areas by river lines are typically located at low ground positions, while the fields to the east and west, north and south are always at the high ground. Therefore, the settlement of Velyka Novosilka itself is located on the low ground. However, they compensate with this by putting fortified positions along the high ground, both to the east and to the south of the settlement. They also have several fortified positions to the west near Vremivka. The objective of the Ukrainians with these fortified positions is to prevent the Russians from flanking the settlement. This is why I have in previous analysis expected the Russians to move over the river line, like they have done near Prichistivka and by Volodar, to capture the settlements on the northern bank of the river line and then move through to the rear of Velyka Novosilka. However, we're now seeing that the Russians are not just working on the eastern parts of Velyka Novosilka, but also the western parts, where the Russians recently captured Levatne, and now they are expanding their zone of control further beyond that. We see with the previous update that the Russians have managed to capture the southern bank of the river line here near Priotne, but have managed to recapture the majority of it as they have previously held this area and further north. The objective of the Russians here is to reach the river line to the north, which will create a strong flank for further offensive operations in the future. The Russians have a front line here near Levatne, where they are facing off against Ukrainian fortified positions near the settlement. Olhivska itself is fairly isolated from anywhere else, and if we zoom in close enough, there are hardly any roads connected to it. There's a river line here, the Solona River, which moves through this eastern pass towards Stepove, where we see that there is a large gap between the Russian settlements here by Levatne, Stepove, and Vishneve to the Ukrainian settlements of Olhivske, Poltavka, and Melinivka, where the only road connection between the two sides goes through Melinivka from the Ukrainian side towards Novoslatopil on the Russian side, and between Olhivske and Stepove yet again. So these are the two crossings between the western and eastern parts. The Russians would look to gain control over Olhivske because it is a midpoint between the Russian and Ukrainian positions. It is like a forward outpost for the Ukrainians. Therefore, capturing the fortified positions along the river lines to the north and capturing Olhivske will secure a buffer zone between the Russian and Ukrainian positions. That is for the western flank. The eastern flank is the Remevsky Lech itself. Therefore, with this, they would have a secure western and eastern flank. Then their objective would be to move in a northern direction towards the supply road to and from Velyka Novosilka, connected to the Zaporizhia region. The Ukrainians have a river line to the south of Novodarivka. There are several fortified positions and another river line further north. This is all in the Zaporizhia region, where the Ukrainians would look to secure the western flank of Velyka Novosilka, as there's only one road that connects Velyka Novosilka directly with the Zaporizhia region, and this is the one moving through the western parts. The Russian objective would be to cut off this road connection, and therefore they would need to gain control over these three settlements to the southern parts of the road, which is Rivnopil, Novodarivka, and Novopil. Therefrom, the Russians would look to cut off the road exactly by this intersection, where they would cut off the connection with Zaporizhia and Velyka Novosilka along the western parts, which would leave fewer roads connected towards Velyka Novosilka and will allow for further offensive operations in a northern direction towards the fortified positions of the Ukrainians in a defensive line that is located north of Velyka Novosilka. It would limit the supplies going to and from Velyka Novosilka. And again, although the Velyka Novosilka is located on the low ground, they have several fortified positions to compensate for that, and it is a supply hub for any Ukrainian operations in the area, both defensive and offensive, because it connects a lot of different parts of the front line, and it acts as a supply hub for this section of the front line. Therefore, the Russians would look to gain control of it, as would allow to facilitate further offensive operations in multiple directions from this location if they manage to gain control of it. As we can see, it is a hub where it connects to several roads in several directions. Therefore, based on recent developments, it can be seen that the Russians are looking to gain control over the intersection here in the western parts, which would limit the supplies going to and from Velyka Novosilka on the western flank, and at the same time they're conducting offensive operations on the eastern flank. They'll likely develop offensive operations further in the northern bank of the river line towards Shakhtarske, Novokrenka, and so on to cut off the supplies on the eastern part as well, which will leave just these two roads in the northern parts. And having control over Shakhtarske will allow the Russians to move along these fortified positions north of Velyka Novosilka, which will be to gain control over the next settlement in the north, Rostolne, and that will allow it cutting off an additional road here in the northern parts. And the final road would be within fire control of the Russian forces, or they can look to gain control over the eastern bank of the river line and thereby fully encircling the settlement. So the main push will most likely come from the eastern direction, but there will also be a significant push from the western direction. Now, attacking both flanks is not just about hitting the supply lines of Velyka Novosilka, but it is also to spread out the front line, because we're currently seeing that the offensive operations are not being interrupted by any changes in the front line. Instead, they are being expanded all the way from now Rivnopil, Levatne, this general area here in the western flank of Velyka Novosilka, and all throughout the entirety of the Donetsk region. Previously, the front line only expanded to Przechistivka in the western direction, and now it has been expanded by 47.5 kilometers. It is somewhere around 50 kilometers. Of course, there was already fighting around Uroshane and Daromeyoske. However, it now also includes Solotaneva and Levatne, and therefore the front line is much wider in the area that the Ukrainians need to cover. This means that the Ukrainian forces are also being spread out thinly. At the same time, the Russians now control Volodar, which means that additional forces need to be sent to cover the now expanded front line, which for the Ukrainians has significantly expanded to now cover a territory of about 75 kilometers from Konstantinivka here in the northern direction all the way to Olhivske in the western direction. And this entire area is now with active offensive operations by the Russians, where previously it was all centered around the road between Volodar and Konstantinivka. It is now expanded to this entire section of the front line, where the Russians are conducting offensive operations on the edge of these locations and all throughout it. This means that the Ukrainian forces have to cover this much larger area. The drone operators and artillery operators in this direction need to be spread out across the entire area. And this means that the Russians can launch offensive operations simultaneously in the different areas, and the Ukrainian forces would have to spread out their forces. It will have a more difficult time to detect these offensive operations when they take place, and it will be more difficult to stop them with solely artillery and drones. This means more direct combat between the Russian and Ukrainian forces, and at that point the Russians gain an advantage due to their superior firepower and numerical superiority as well. All in all, it is clear what the Russians are going for with these operations, and it seems so far it is working. We'll have to see on a longer time period what exactly will happen, but the fact that they are expanding the front line further again shows that the Russian offensive is nowhere near ending. Instead, it is simply escalating the more time goes by. And that'll be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.